Making a new product is hard. It requires years of development, amounting in engineering feats, new architectures, sometimes even new process nodes. But here at Intel, we need to iterate to make our number bigger so we can sell more things. We've learned that bigger number equals big customer. And that's why we've advanced our technology to have the new generationless generational improvement. Generationally. This enables companies everywhere to make bigger number better, but without all of the hard work of making the number bigger better. Our new 14700K CPU is 1,000 bigger than the 13700K, which means it's 7.3% better just in name alone. And that is just the beginning. Our expert mathematicians are still working on it, but we hope to soon invent even bigger number for bigger better, so bigger customer buy more numbers.
Hey, Steve, X3D is still beating us.
Fuck! Today we're reviewing the Intel i7-14700K. It's a new CPU coming out with the 14 series. This is the wrong one, they all look the same. It's okay, they perform the same too. So Intel's launching the 14600K, 14900K, and 14700K, and the 147 is the only one that has any chance of being even remotely a shakeup from the last generation. Generation. We're gonna have to do that a lot today because it has changed the core count. This series, CPU launch, is Intel's attempt to buy some more time, maybe from investors, but up until they can launch something that's properly a new architecture. And we think that's because AMD's X3D caught Intel by surprise, even back in the 58 X3D, where now they are scrambling to shove anything out the door to try and retain as many gaming customers as they can up until a time at which Intel has something properly new to launch. But the 14000 series is not actually a generational change, despite a generational name change. We brought you this video with store.gamersnexus.net and our affordable GPU teardown 10-piece toolkits, also our solder and project mats, and our large volt mod mats. Every time you see a GN Store ad, that means we're further accomplishing our goal of reducing reliance on PC hardware advertisers. The store just got a fresh restock of tools for your PC building, including the 10-piece kits with custom ground hex heads for clearing SMDs, multiple options for Phillips and Allen drives, and more. Our projects and solder mats have also been highly received by the community, offering an extremely heat-resistant surface that works for random projects or for electronics repair. And finally, this video is also brought to you by our large volt mod mats, a mainstay that's ever popular for its massive anti-static conductive work surface and pinout diagrams for PC building. Head to store.gamersnexus.net to support us directly. Here's the quick recap of what's going on. The new CPUs are called Raptor Lake Refresh. So it's an update on the 13 series, but instead of using a name like 13650K, 13950K, 13900KS, I guess there's already a KS, something like that, Intel just wanted to change the whole number to make it sound better than it is, and so that's what they've done. Now, this is still socketable in the existing board, so Z790 will work with it. In theory, Z690 board should work with it. Check the BIOS updates. But aside from being socketable in the same boards, there are other things that are the same, and a lot of those have to do with the CPU itself, other than slight clock increases, and in the 147's case, an actual core change. So the new old 14700K climbs from an 8P core, 8E core, 24-thread configuration to an 8P core, 12E core, and 28-thread configuration. It has 4 extra cores in the E capacity. Even still, those are extra cores. Frequency also climbs. Intel says its max turbo frequency is now 5.6 gigahertz, up from 5.4 on the 13700K. Sadly, this is shy of some of the 6 gigahertz rumors for the 147, and that's not going to help it. Likewise, the E-core turbo has climbed 100 megahertz. Base clock remains the same. Cache has also increased, which makes sense because the core count increased, and that carries with it more cache here. The official Intel site claims an increase of 4 megabytes in L2 cache. TDP remains the same. It looks like a desperate launch, like a scramble. And so for pricing, they land at the same MSRP as the 13 series. Unfortunately for Intel, the prices aren't MSRP anymore. They've moved a little bit. And so the $440 for the 14700K, $415 for the 14700K, if those end up higher than the current 13700 series, depending on where you look at them. Likewise, the 14900K is supposed to be a $600 pricing right now, or at least that's what it was on Newegg when we checked earlier, because they're up for pre-order today when we're filming. But Intel's 13900K can actually regularly be found for far cheaper than that these days in the 500s. We saw 550 to 570 commonly for the 13900K, and the 13700K is around $400 now. So instantly, Intel will struggle to fight its own value proposition. But we need to look at the rest of the current landscape for positioning as well. So believe it or not, the R7-5800X3D is still available. Not everywhere, but it is still around. We saw it for $320. There are listings on Newegg for $360. The 7800X3D is another relevant competitor, and that one is now under $400 on average. Just the other day, we ran a story about how it was $350 on a couple of retailers. So we're going to get into the data for this. There's a lot of it. We're going to be reviewing all three CPUs in separate pieces. So the 14900K will follow. That one will be particularly interesting for the thermals and the power consumption. And then the 14600, I almost said 13600K. It's okay, it's the same. The 14600K is last. All of this data is brand new. We just collected it in the past week. It is an entirely refreshed test suite, which is awesome. We're really excited about it. So we have some new games in there like Baldur's Gate 3 and Starfield. We've kept Stellaris around. We've updated Cyberpunk to Phantom Liberty. Lots of cool stuff going on with the test suite at least. So this will be the debut of all of that new data. This is not comparable to prior data because we've updated basically everything and built new OSs for this. But at least it kind of gets us prepped for more CPU launches or whatever in the future. Now, a couple other things. Sample size is something that's come up from commonly people who are newer to learning about computer hardware. So if you're curious about, well, but what about sample size? It's only one unit. We have a whole video on that where we tested 68 CPUs and found the variance to commonly be within 1 to 2% unit to unit. You should check that out. It's linked below. It's an awesome resource with a lot of research that went into it. You might learn something there. But the reason to bring that up is because the variance from 13,000 to 14,000 kind of falls within that sample size range a lot of the time, depending on what you're testing. All right, let's get started. We'll look at power first and get into games. Our power consumption tests will start with a chart showing only the Intel i7 series, and then we'll look at a comparison. We've been fortunate to collect power data on over 150 CPU configurations over the years, so we can just start splitting that into cool different charts. This test looks at all-core power consumption in a Blender workload. In an all-core workload with the Intel i7-14700K, the new CPU consumes 284 watts at the EPS 12-volt rails during the test. That's power to the CPU and VRM efficiency losses, not total system power. So this is already a power-hungry chip. But it's not much different from the 13700K, which itself was around 280 watts. The Raptor Lake generation and the refresh remains the most power-hungry in all-core for the i7s. If we look back further, the 12700K pulled around 158 watts in the same test, around the same as the last gen i5-13600K, which will be shown on the next chart. Going back further, the 11700K was around 126 watts, although various BIOS versions could push it closer to 200 if out of the guidance, but 126 watts was Intel guidance. The 7700K overclocked pulled about the same, or 78 watts when stock. The 8700K was about 84 watts. As a final reference for this one, the 4770K, which is one of the oldest currently on this chart, although we have other prior data, that one pulled 83 watts. So the 13700K kicked it into a higher gear and the 147 followed. The extra few watts is close enough to call them the same. Here's a lot of the more recent options, including competition. The Intel i7-14700K outdraws the 7950X and its 263 watt consumption by an impressive 20 watts. So it's time to update our cooler benches, which is exactly what we're doing right now, actually, because CPUs are drawing more power, so we need a higher heat load to start testing them. And that'll be coming up soon, so stay tuned to the channel for the updated cooler benches. The 14700K also outdraws the 12900K, and for AMD, its most dangerous competitor in gaming would be the 7800X3D, which pulls just 86 watts for the same workload. The 5800X3D remains relevant as well, plotted around 108 watts here. At the uppermost end, the 13900K ran at 295 watts when stock on the test platform we used, and these numbers come down during gaming, of course, but they come down fairly uniformly. Everyone gets a reduction when it's not all-core. Intel is pushing power hard for all-core boosting right now, and high-end coolers become more of a necessity than they were a few generations ago. Now for the interesting chart. This is energy efficiency, and it's calculated by taking our Blender render time, the time required in minutes, and running a simple watt-hours calculation against the power consumption. The end result is the energy consumption required to complete the full render, so faster is better in isolation, but depending on the power draw, it may be less energy efficient. Here's the chart. The 14700K ranked at 37.7 watt-hours in this calculation. Lower is better, so that has it less efficient than almost anything else on the chart. It's at least improved over the 13700K, dropping from 42.4 watt-hours previously. Even if the 14700K is faster than many of these CPUs, it's also pulling more power to complete the same work. Whether that matters to you is a personal choice. If you need the fastest thing possible, or the fastest sort of within a price range, then power is often one of the sacrifices. If you're running these all the time though, and you're concerned about the power bill, or maybe heat gain in a room, this is a factor to strongly consider. We'll talk about raw performance separately, but some high-end competitors would include the 5950X, which is one of the most power-efficient CPUs we've ever tested. Its binning was phenomenal, and the voltage requirement was very low to keep it stable. The 7950X also scores significantly better than the 14700K in efficiency. Intel's all-core power efficiency is definitely behind AMD's right now. AMD remains impressive here, and check out our prior AMD Eco Mode testing on the 7950X to see where it can do even better. Rainbow Six Siege is up next. This game has insanely high FPS ceilings, so it makes for an excellent tool to compare CPUs, and that frame rate's actually useful to competitive players. The R7-7800X3D blows way past everything in these charts, setting its own ceiling at 717 FPS average. It's impressive for the AMD CPU, especially considering it's been $350 on US retailers lately. The 5800X3D is next in the running at 650 FPS average or so. These numbers, again, are crazy high to even talk about, but that's kind of where the performance is these days. The lows are relatively consistent, especially considering how high the FPS is here, and the 14700K is functionally tied in average with the 5800X3D. You'll never notice that difference, and if we retested them again, they might slightly trade places. Lows are technically higher for the 14.7, but given the standard deviation of 1% lows can be as high as 10 FPS in this particular game, depending on which set of runs it is, these end up roughly tied. Generationally, the 14700K is tied with the former flagship 13900K. It's within 1% of the 7700X, which is currently $300 to $330, and it's ahead of the prior 13700K by less than 2%. That is a shockingly disappointing lead for the 14700K over the 13700K, considering there are actually some differences between the i7s here. Just from this game, you'd want to buy whichever one is cheaper and not worry about the rest between these two. Users of the R5-3600 would see an uplift in the range of 80% moving to the 14.7, more so if you're on older Ryzen generations, but then you might as well get a 5800X3D and keep the same motherboard. Your cost is way lower there. At 1440p, AM5 leads again. We're bouncing off of a GPU bind at the very top end, restricted by the 4090. As evidenced by the reduced maximum frame rate. The 14700K isn't quite there, instead ending up in a cluster with the 7700X, the 13900K, and the 58X3D, and most of the other high-end CPUs. Its lead over the 13700K is once again irrelevant, unfortunately, but this goes to show that even at 1440p, there can still be scaling with modern high-end video cards. Most of these are functionally the same though. The 7700X, for example, basically equals the 14700K. F1 2023 is up now. The F1 series has been in our bench for years at this point, and is another game that generally scales well across CPUs and GPUs alike, plus ray tracing inclusion makes it a good test candidate for GPUs. Looking at the 1080p results for CPUs, the 7800X3D leads once again. It's at 511 FPS average here. The lows are slightly reduced versus other CPUs, but not meaningfully. The 5800X3D is also in the upper echelon of CPUs here, hanging on to a podium finish with a 452 FPS average result. The 14700K results, though, place it down at 407 FPS average, ahead of the 13700K by 4.4%. We've never seen such exciting, massive gains. In fact, we didn't even know numbers went that high. The prior 1.8% differences, that's one thing, but 4.4%? That's an incredible feat of technology.
And wow, it has been fun.
Intel is finally back to its full form. It hasn't had numbers this single digit since before Ryzen launched. Phenomenal.
You can literally see it.
At 1440p, the 14700K's mind-blowing technological prowess strikes even harder. This time we're seeing a 4.19786096256684% improvement in average FPS over the prior 13700K. That's almost as many numbers as an AMD mobile CPU name. So they're doing something right. The results overall on this chart have come down, even those which were distant from the GPU bottleneck. We see that with the 5800X, which dropped about 20 FPS off the average from its 1080p result. The 14700K is functionally at the top of the chart though. It's hitting limits, as are the 7800X3D, the 7950X, and other nearby neighbors. Let's move to the next one. Baldur's Gate 3 is up now. This is brand new to our test suite, but we already studied it extensively in our GPU benchmark video. That video goes into detail on things like the GPU busy metrics for Baldur's Gate 3, plus some information on Vulkan versus DirectX 11, where we're testing within Baldur's Gate City, things like that. The standard deviation run for all our CPUs averaged out to 0.9 average FPS here, 1.4 for the 1% lows, and 4.1 for 0.1% lows. So Baldur's Gate 3 is remarkably consistent and makes for an excellent CPU benchmark. At 1080p with DirectX 11, the 14700K ran at 106 FPS average, slightly behind the 13900K, and about 1 to 2% better than the 13700K. The 14700K multi-classing into more E-cores unfortunately didn't benefit it here. Like a mimic deep in Undermountain, the 14700K looks like the healing potion that Intel needs, until you realize you only get to roll 1d4 on use, and then you have to subtract 1. It's not a bad CPU at all, but it's not a meaningful improvement, especially in this game. If you were buying Intel no matter what, the choice between the top 3 Intel performers doesn't matter in this game benchmark. The X3D CPUs, meanwhile, blow past everything. They're really impressive. This review has made us more interested, once again, in those than so far we are in this 14700K. At 1440p, the standard deviation is even lower for 1% and 0.1% lows, about the same for average FPS. The results are slightly impacted, but overall we're looking at even scaling. We're still effectively completely CPU bound. There's nothing new to see here, just another 1d4 minus 1 health potion. Cyberpunk Phantom Liberty tests are next. These are brand new to our test suite. We're not using any ray tracing options here. That'd create a GPU bind in most scenarios, and we want to see CPU scaling. This game has a specific setting of importance. The SMT toggle has been updated in recent patches and now should automatically toggle off for some CPU configurations. According to CDPR, the SMT option will flip when core count is under 8 cores. We have the option of forcing SMT on for all CPUs, forcing it off, or allowing it to follow the behavior that'll result in the best performance as according to the game's native settings configurations. We decided to use the SMT toggle on auto, which actually isn't really that auto, it's a dumb toggle. It just flips at 8 cores. This allows each CPU to maximize its performance, but in a predictable way. It's not a random auto, and it's also really the way you should be using it. Here's the chart. Unfortunately for Intel, in this one, we just didn't see any scaling with the 14700K. The results are within error of each other. AMD is pulling far ahead with the 7800X3D, again. The gap is 24% here in average FPS, but the 7800X3D is doing well, as is the 5800X3D actually. The R7-7700X also leads Intel's new CPU here. 1440p has the same lineup. We're mostly bound by the CPU, which is good for scaling. The top of the results get truncated a little bit with the resolution increase though. Final Fantasy remains one of Intel's strongest games, so this should be more of a beneficial test for the new CPUs. X3D doesn't trend as high here. You'll notice that 5800X3D and 7800X3D are bound up at effectively the same frame rate. The 13900K leads this chart, at least until we run our 14900K review, which will be on the channel within the next 24 hours. But the 13900K for now holds a 2.3% lead over the new 14700K, which itself rests near 256 FPS average. Now for the exciting part. That's a staggering, and this is a big number, so get ready, 3.18% difference, improvement, better than the 13700K. Incredible, they've done it. We don't know what they've done, but we're glad they did. Now that might not seem like much, but moving on, if you're choosing between a 13700K and 14700K and they cost exactly the same, then sure, the 14700K is the better CPU. But otherwise, so far, this isn't convincing enough on its own. The 1440p results were the same. We're CPU bound, so we still see scaling even at the higher resolution. Stellaris is next. In this one, we're testing simulation time measured in seconds across 4 test passes. This isn't an FPS benchmark, but a time benchmark, so lower is better. Unfortunately, we're just not seeing the scaling past about 30 to 31 seconds for the simulation time. Everything hits a wall, and the jumble at the top doesn't actually mean any CPU is better than the other, just that they're all the same. We're using a late game state for this, so it should be fairly intensive. That said, we want to experiment with some other ones. The game has a lot of potential because it scales great above the 31-second mark. Just look at the gap from the 2700 to the 7700X. We want to experiment with some more save game files, so if you have a really late game save with a lot of complexity, and if you want to see us continue to use this test, please email it over to us at tips@gamersnexus.net. We'll see if we can find some more scaling room in one of those saves. For now, though, the 14700K and the 13700K are about the same, a far, far cry from our staggering, world-ending 3% differences we've seen so far. Speaking of space games, time to go to one that needs some work. Starfield is new to our CPU test suite. We're testing using the latest version of the game as of October 11th, first at 1080p low, and then we'll look at high. The 14700K at 1080p low ran at 126 FPS average, posting what was unironically the most exciting result so far, 7.6% improvement over the 13700K. That's it. We've done it, folks. We can all go home. We got the big gains. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve.
This puts the 14700K near the 13900K and technically ahead of the 7800X3D. AMD CPUs generally run slower in this game, with Intel largely controlling the top half of this chart. At 1080p high instead, we saw a similar lineup, but with a truncated top end for performance. Nothing that stands out here, so we'll move on. Now we're on to production benchmarks. These actually show some double-digit improvements, not always, but at least we see them sometimes. It gives us proof that numbers larger than 9 exist. We didn't know that before. We'll start with Blender, the 3D modeling and animation software. The i7-14700K finished in 8 minutes here, improving upon the 13700K with a 12% reduction in time required to complete the render. That is literally the first time ever anyone has seen a number as large as 12%. It's like back in the good old days when Intel would give us Skylake after Skylake. The 13900K still outdoes the 14700K by 9%. This is because Blender will use every thread given to it all at 100%, so we see more scaling. AMD's closest competitors would be the 7950X, which leads and costs $590 right now. That's a 20% reduction against the 14700K for the performance positioning. The 7900X is next and gives up a 7% lead to the 14700K. File compression and decompression are measured in millions of instructions per second, or MIPS. In compression, the 14700K completed 171,000 MIPS, so it's 9% ahead of the 13700K here. It's still behaving like an overclocked 13700K despite the extra cores, although those at least benefited it in Blender. But either way, the 147 at least does something in production. The 7800X is AMD's closest price competitor, with the 14700K ahead by 4.6%. Decompression is interesting since the stack shuffles sometimes, so here the 14700K gets led by the AMD 5950X from a generation prior, and by a lot, 17%. The 14700K improves over the 13700K by 12%, but it loses to last-gen AMD, and that's not a great position. The next chart looks at the best CPUs for Adobe Premiere using Puget Bench. This is scored in aggregate, and the 14700K scored 822 points here, which means it outperforms the 13700K by a staggering 3.1%. We're back to those groundbreaking numbers that Intel allowed us to discover earlier. The 7950X leads the 14700K by about 1% here. Not a ton of difference at the high end in this one. Adobe Photoshop had the 14700K at 1548 points in aggregate, functionally tied with the 13900K and the 7900X. The top of the scoring in this one isn't spread out much. And then for the lead over the 13700K, that's 3.5% here. So that's it for the 14700K review. This was less of a savior than we thought it might be, the 7 specifically. That core count is what we were really hoping would shake things up a little bit for Intel. But in production, we had one number that was only like 12% improved over the 13700K. Okay, that's not bad. The problem is that's really the only place we're seeing it. It's a couple production tests. at best, it's like 9 to 12%, but not even always there. We had 3% gains in some cases. And then a lot of the games are just really unexciting. So what this comes down to in terms of buyer's advice is if you are selecting a CPU and you've landed on, you want the 13700K specifically, you're wondering, is this one worth it? Or you want the 14700K specifically, what you need to look at next is the pricing. Because if the pricing is higher on the 14.7 and you're specifically using it only for gaming, you're not going to get much use out of the extra, let's say 10 to 12% uplift in some other applications, then you're not getting anything for that extra money. You should just spend less and get one of the other CPUs. If you're going to do something with one of the applications specifically that saw 10 to 12% uplift, well, okay, great. I consider it, I guess, but the problem is really just that the value is overall not there. There's plenty of competition, both from Intel's own prior generation, like the 13900K, for example. Certainly that's going to drop in price too. And AMD's existing and prior generation. So at least the 14700K moves sometimes in some places, but overall the gaming is more or less identical to the 13700K. That means, like, effectively, even though there's a core count change, but in terms of actual realized performance in a real gaming scenario, what that means is that we could buy a different 13700K off the shelf, and in cases where we're seeing like a 1.8% change, that might be the same. That the different 13700K might be the same as what we're seeing for the 14.7 here. So this is just not a strong launch for Intel. It comes across as kind of desperate and weak. There are reminders of the 11th series, which genuinely we had forgotten about. There was like one good CPU in that, kind of, but the rest of them were a waste of sand. The weird one with this is it's not even a waste of materials, because they probably just would have been 13,000 series CPUs anyway, which people have been buying. They just have a new name now. So if you look at these as basically a slightly pre-overclocked 13,000 series CPU, then you won't be disappointed, because that's what it is. So that's it for the 14700K review. Thank you for watching. Support us directly if you like these videos. You should grab one of our mod mats or project and soldering mats on the store. The project mats specifically are high heat resistant mats for not only soldering, but you could also use them with other projects. For example, Vitaly on our team tested them out working with a Dremel on some kind of car part or something. So anyway, check those out on store.gamersnexus.net. It helps support us and our testing directly. Despite Intel's effort here, we actually put a lot in. So thank you for your support. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.